Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at regulation of the internet. How much of it is needed, and what form should it take? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. We're focusing today on the regulation of the internet. Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen argues that her former employer persistently puts profit above prevention of harm. Facebook chief Mark Zuckerberg himself argues that greater regulation of internet companies is needed and that rules for what is and isn't allowed should be made through democratic means. And the UK, among other countries, is in the process of preparing legislation with just that goal in mind. So, what exactly are the problems that the current Wild West of the World Wide Web gives rise to? What principles should guide any new legislation? And where do those principles take us in terms of concrete policy? Well, we have two leading experts on these matters here at UCL, and they join me now. Dr. Melanie Garson is lecturer in international conflict resolution and international security in the UCL Department of Political Science. She is also the Internet Policy Lead for Europe, Israel, and the Middle East in the Technology and Public Policy Department of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, where she focuses on cybersecurity policy as well as the intersection of technology and foreign policy. And Dr. Jeff Howard is Associate Professor of Political Theory in the UCL Department of Political Science. Regular listeners to the podcast will already be familiar with his work on regulating dangerous political speech. He's currently writing a book on the ethical limits of free speech, and he was recently awarded a highly prestigious UK Research and Innovation Future Leaders Fellowship to lead a major new interdisciplinary project on the governance of online speech. Jeff and Melanie, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. And let's begin by identifying the problem or the problems here. Why does the internet need to be regulated? Melanie, do you want to go first?
Ultimately, the internet needs to be regulated so that the good of the internet, or the internet as a force for good, is accessible to all. And that as countries become increasingly digitalized, particularly as countries leapfrog into that development, making sure that both the technical infrastructure as well as what's flowing on top of that infrastructure is in effect like a clean river, that people are able to dip into it and be able to access all the benefits of the technologies that are connected towards it. And even more critically, when we think about still that we have 3.9 billion people to come online to the internet, to be able to prepare for that so that it is in effect a public good that is a force for good.
I like that metaphor of the clean river. What are the potential pollutants that we need to be aware of in that river?
Well, the potential pollutants come from all sources, and this is becoming the tendency that both the internet at both its structural roots and what's flowing on it is a place of geopolitical contest. It's whether there's still areas of, the lawful but awful action that's going on, as well as the genuinely unlawful action that's going on. And then how do we hold people to account for that? And also, how do we create responsibility to protect what is a precious resource that's extraordinarily powerful for good, but can easily be, like all technologies or anything, in fact, can be weaponized or in the wrong hands be used for destruction and discord.
Jeff, how would you characterize the problems, the harms that we need to be attending to here?
Well, social media platforms are clearly used for a wide range of hugely valuable purposes, but I think it's important not to cheerlead the upsides of the internet and social media in particular, without taking seriously the downsides. And I think the truth is that platforms have been abused by nefarious actors to spread a wide range of of harmful content. Now, some of that content's already illegal. Think of content inciting terrorism or disseminating child sexual abuse material. But some content, even if it is currently legal, becomes harmful when it's aggregated and amplified and floods users' news feeds. And that includes legal content that poses special harms to children. So think of content promoting eating disorders and other forms of self-harm, as well as legal content that poses harm to adults, like hateful and vitriolic abuse. And I think it's also important to remember that some of this content undermines important public goods. So we might think of disinformation about electoral matters or about COVID-19. And just finally, I do think the harm of this content is exacerbated when it is all anyone in a particular echo chamber even sees. And that's a problem having to do not so much with the moderation of harmful content, but actually with the overall design of social media platforms.
And so those echo chambers effects that you're referring to there is an argument, isn't there, that the social media and the echo chambers within social media have been important in leading to what seems like a sharp polarization in many societies and in our political discourse in recent years. Is that fair?
That's exactly right. And the social science is pretty clear on this. When you put people in these echo chambers where they're exposed to people who are like-minded, the effect is that people become radicalized. So you put center-left people in an echo chamber with other center-left people, and they become ever more enthusiastic for left-wing ideas. So it goes with people on the right. And I think if we care about the cultivation of a healthy democratic discourse where people are able to hear people from different points of view and engage one another in robust but respectful terms to find common ground, it doesn't seem like the internet as currently constructed, at least with respect to the main social media platforms, is especially well suited to that project as it stands.
And Melanie, I guess I've been aware of that debate mainly as it exists in the UK and other established democracies. But I was quite struck when I was listening to Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower recently, that she was talking about the impact of Facebook in countries like Myanmar and Ethiopia, so countries that are experiencing conflict at the moment. And she was talking about how, even the levels of moderation and control that exist on Facebook in the UK and the US in English language medium just don't exist in anything like the same degree in some of these countries. But actually the impact that social media can have on conflict-ridden societies can be really negative and serious.
That's absolutely true. And we know that sort of from the papers and the revelations that we know that Facebook's sort of investment even into their moderation practice that exists sort of for, 0, 1, 2 sort of countries was much higher and that only, I think it's about 6% of Arabic language sort of insight and behavior is caught through the way that they currently do moderation. The fact that communication, any form of communication in conflict has been used, has the potential to be used for mobilization with tragic consequences, whether it was from the radio to Rwanda to what we're seeing with Facebook being used and both. And there's the two sides of that. There's people praising the benefits of it in its use of mobilization to the Arab Spring. That same benefit has the harmful benefit when we're seeing what's happened now. I think the bigger question is that these online platforms have been absolutely tragically slow in engaging with international public policy. It's only very, very recently, even, they've had representation that's been thinking about the international political ramifications of what they're doing. And there's a bigger question right now with looking at these implications of what should be the geopolitical status, or a sort of acknowledging the geopolitical status of these huge companies and what sort of responsibilities that entails and how that should be engaged with. We worked on a proposal at TBI that's looking at should these big platforms be part of a union that then takes representation, observer status at the UN, so they're more directly engaged in these conversations and their responsibilities can be questioned. Ian Bremmer recently wrote a big piece, again, looking at the geopolitical status of these companies and where they have to sit in that framework. So there's a much sort of larger question of responsibility sitting here.
So that's really interesting. So I was going to go on next to the question of policy and what we should do in response. And I guess we need to start off with thinking about what are the basic principles of policy. And Melanie, I suppose you're saying there that thinking about power dynamics across the world as a whole and thinking about who is involved in the conversation about the policy responses to these difficulties is actually one key principle that we need to bear in mind.
Absolutely. I mean, the large platforms, big tech, have been involved increasingly in some of the more structural forums. So things like the Internet Governance Forums, they have been taking on more of a role in the multi-stakeholder fora that exists. But there is a sense of that they're going to have to, step out of this isn't Mark Zuckerberg in his room in Harvard anymore. It's a bigger question of huge amounts of geopolitical influence and sort of the recognition of the responsibility that comes from and what the principles within the global order has to be to look at it. And that's not saying that we give them the same power as states, even though they're sort of funded to the same power as states, but their interaction or channels for interaction with the global order has to be improved and be made more transparent.
And Jeff, you're a political philosopher, so you think deeply about principles all the time. What principles would you say should guide the development of policy in this area?
Well, I think it's about striking that balance between preventing harm and respecting free speech. Now, I think that we can think through these different categories of harmful content, and broadly speaking, if the harmful content is the kind of content that the user himself or herself has a moral duty to refrain from, then in my analysis, that falls outside the protection of free speech. So think of speech that incites religious or racial hatred. I think that speakers have duties to refrain from speech like that. And that's why laws like we have in the UK that criminalize religious incitement to religious and racial hatred are acceptable. Now, when it comes to regulating these platforms, the key is to incentivize the platforms to target illegitimate, harmful content without incentivizing them to remove or at least over remove legitimate content. So here's an example. So suppose we want platforms to get rid of misinformation about COVID-19. One way they could do that would just be to ban all posts that mention COVID-19. But that would clearly be wildly over-inclusive. That would catch way more content, both the illegitimate, harmful content and perfectly legitimate, informed discussion and commentary about a pressing public health matter. So catch way more content that would be legitimate to take down. So I think it's absolutely crucial when we're designing these policies that we have one eye on ensuring that platforms take seriously their responsibilities to remove illegitimate, harmful content, but we don't over-incentivize them to remove legitimate content. So that I think is the key to well-designed regulation in this area.
And could you just explain a little further this kind of territory of things that we think people shouldn't do, that people have a moral obligation not to do, but nevertheless we don't ban them from doing? Why is it important that that kind of space exists and that we should be thinking carefully about what we do in that area?
So I think that there are some instances or some categories of harmful speech that are properly criminalized, terrorist incitement, the dissemination of child sexual abuse material, and we'll speak shortly about the online safety bill. These are categories of already illegal content, and platforms have a moral responsibility, and if this legislation passes, they will have a legal responsibility to take swift measures to remove this content and to design their systems to minimize its presence on the platform. But there are going to be other categories of harmful speech that aren't currently criminalized, and that for a variety of reasons, both moral and pragmatic, we may decide we don't want to criminalize. So for example, it seems that content that promotes eating disorders is seriously morally objectionable. I think there is a moral duty to refrain from disseminating that content. But I think it would be totally coherent to say, well, we're not going to criminalize that content, but we are going to require the social media platforms to reduce its dissemination and especially to keep it away from children. I don't think there's anything contradictory about holding that position, given that there is a wide range of content that causes harm, even if it is legal.
And do you just want to spell out why we don't just criminalize that kind of content? Why shouldn't we go down that path of just having very clear rules saying this is stuff that you just cannot say?
So I am extremely sympathetic to that position. The point I want to make is that even if we don't criminalize the content, I think it would be permissible to require social media companies to take action against it, provided we define these categories clearly and through a democratically accountable process. But now that you mention it, it's worth noting that the Law Commission has recommended creating new offenses for online communications that indeed include encouraging self-harm, that include cyber flashing, that include sending knowingly false communications with an intent to cause harm. And interestingly, if the government picks up these proposals, and we've heard some noises that there is sympathy for adopting at least some of these proposals, then that will expand the amount of illegal content that social media platforms will have a duty to remove. So I think we will be seeing more and more policy heading in exactly the direction you described.
But I guess a key point here is that there will always be some things that we think are potentially harmful, but that it would not be appropriate to criminalize. I mean, misleading statements about matters of policy in the world of politics, for example. Presumably, there's quite a lot of terrain there that it would just be very, very dangerous to start introducing bans on free speech because of the danger that you end up preventing proper scrutiny and people being able to express themselves freely and openly and advocate for potentially kind of controversial and difficult positions.
Absolutely. So, for example, this Law Commission proposal to criminalize knowingly false communications with an intent to cause, as it says, non-trivial emotional, psychological, or physical harm, that doesn't address broader forms of misinformation or disinformation about the political process that don't concern harms to particular individuals, but rather concern harms to democratic political culture generally. Even if we decide not to criminalize that kind of conduct, it would, in my view, still make sense to demand that social media companies develop a position and take action against that kind of conduct. Absolutely.
Okay, so we're talking here about forms of speech that have potential to cause harm, but where we think action short of banning is appropriate. And then, of course, that leads to the question, well, what methods might actually work or not work for discouraging harmful speech and limiting the effects of harmful speech? Melanie, this is a topic that you have thought about a great deal. What would your insights be in terms of what methods work and what methods don't work?
I think there's a number of approaches, and I think there's also a way of, whether we think of socio-technical approaches or sort of, and looking at it within the framework. So it's not always just using regulation as we think about it, or what the kind of regulation, the kind of questions that we can ask of the social media companies in themselves, bearing in mind that, if we analogize this in the sense that cars didn't have seatbelts for, decades from when cars were invented. And I think we're seeing, the same, not that I think social media companies are perfect, but I think we have to accept the evolution of where social media companies have come from what they thought they were doing to where they've ended up and what needs to be built in. So yes, social media companies, this I think comes more into the product development life cycle, particularly if we're looking, I'm even more forward where we're looking at something like Facebook's announcement of the metaverse, and sort of now Meta, as it's now called it, where online harms isn't just going to be words. How is it going to be related if an avatar has a T-shirt that's got harmful speech across it? What's going to happen if in that universe there's a firework display that's putting harmful words on it? So I think there's sort of real questions of where we put this into the design, to altering the product development life cycle and the transparency within that. And I think this is what came out with the Facebook papers. And the biggest question this opens up is the platform's sort of processes to identify and regulate has to become a lot more transparent to be for any of this to work. Approaches that have been looked at can be everything from different ways of utilizing digital identity can be verified at various stages, that then and only certain that you can either self-regulate content that is verified towards you, and so that can be age appropriate content, that can be politically appropriate content. So if there's a digital sort of approach of thinking about that, they're thinking about the life cycle of decision making that the platforms take when they're building out their different processes. There's also different ways of thinking about independent auditing, which goes back to probably what we're going to come back to thinking about with online harms. But if you think about just auditing of financial services, who's overseeing this, who's looking at this? Auditing of financial services, to be an auditor, you have to have the right people with the right experience, 3 years of technical experience to be able to do this independent oversight. So how do we think about those kinds of processes with tech expertise to oversee them? There's also other paradigms we can look at. We can look at paradigms like consumer protection legislation and thinking about, well, how does that, can we use those kinds of approaches? So there's a number of ways of wider framing, but ultimately, I think we need to look at these institutional mechanisms that from the outset of dealing with the problem logics of what we're going to see, particularly thinking forward, so that we're not always, I'm always saying it's a bit like Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, that we're always trying to drop the regulation just that bit after it's gone that much forward. And how do we sort of think about these institutional mechanisms that are much more sort of forward thinking and based on principles of responsibility, or ethics of responsibility, like covering your mouth when you cough, to stop it, that will allow the system to develop in a more coherent and stronger, useful fashion.
It's interesting when you make the analogy with financial regulation, consumer product regulation, and so on. I mean, I guess a lot of the kind of public discourse on this issue so far is about, should we be regulating algorithms? Should we be regulating, I don't know, some other particular bit of this overall process? But when we think about financial regulation, lay people like me have no clue really of what the regulations are or what the processes are for the regulators to get under the bonnet and really understand what's going on. And I suppose what you're saying is that we need something of that kind of model with real expert regulators going kind of deep into these organizations and understanding what they're up to, and guiding what they're up to, rather than having necessarily very simple rules that people like me can understand sitting outside, sitting on the surface. So it's going to be quite a complex and difficult ongoing process here.
I think in some ways the regulator, yes, they should be doing that on one side, and then they should be the explainer and translator out to the public so they can, take advantage of their role to do the information gathering, to do the expertise, and then they do translate it in a comprehensible way. The other thing about this regulation of these types of platforms is that also there has to be global coherence, that there needs to be more conversations or some sort of forum for those regulators in different countries to be communicating with each other so it's consistent and coherent and works across the board. And the phrase you'll hear from the technical thing is also facilitating that interoperability at a platform level. And part of the questions, and I'm sure Jeff sort of deals with it, is the free feature, this question of interoperability and whether it sort of increases or sort of decreases the amplification of some of these ideas, is that having that global conversation between these regulators is also going to strengthen the system.
Jeff, I was going to bring you in on the UK legislation that's being developed at the moment. But before I do that, do you want to pick up on anything that Melanie's just said?
I think it's absolutely essential that Ofcom play this role in the United Kingdom, both of getting inside the organizations, looking under the car bonnet, as it were, really understanding what's going on, both with their content moderation systems, but also with their wider system and platform design. But as Melanie said, translating that to the public, because I think that somewhat unlike financial regulation, there is a basic liberty at play here, which is the right to free speech. And our free speech interests are going to be affected by the way that the Secretary of State for DCMS, the way in which Ofcom interprets and through further secondary legislation, codes of practice, develops this legislation down the road. And really the fate of the public discourse of our democracy doesn't quite hang in the balance, but it's certainly at play in thinking about this legislation, because it fundamentally is a matter of what will people be allowed to say online or not. One way the state can censor your speech is by directly threatening to punish you if you say something. But another way it can censor your speech is by threatening to punish anybody who gives you a platform, right? Even if it declines to punish you. And I think that is the worry raised by this kind of legislation, that and I think free speech activists around the world are very concerned and quite skeptical about this legislation and others like it around the world, because they worry that governments will use it in order to crack down on speech that challenges them. And of course, authoritarian governments around the world are doing precisely this and are requiring social media companies to comply with local law, which often has very expansive requirements on what citizens, or very expansive restrictions on what citizens are allowed to say. And so I think all of this means that task of translation, of getting the public involved so that we know what's going on, will be really, really important.
So what would you say about the online safety bill in the UK? So we've got it in draft form at the moment. What would you say? Does it get the balance right?
I think it's a wonderful step in the right direction. I think it can be tightened up in various respects, but I'm broadly enthusiastic about it. And I think those that claim that this particular bill is a fundamental threat to freedom of expression in the UK are probably overstating its problems. I think it's probably useful to just briefly remind people what this bill will exactly do. So it's a hugely complex and quite long piece of legislation. It's jam-packed with nuances and qualifications. So we're really only going to be able to do a rough and ready analysis of it here. But basically, it covers user-to-user services like social media platforms. It covers search engines. But let's focus on the case of social media platforms. And in a nutshell, what it will do is impose three kinds of legal duties on social media platforms. One concerns content that's already illegal, like terrorist incitement and child sexual abuse material. Another concerns content that's legal but harmful to children. And a third duty, which will apply to only what's called Category 1 services, which are basically the really big social media networks, concerns content that's legal but harmful to adults. And in each case, the platforms will be required to undertake a risk assessment that will identify what kind of illegal or harmful content appears on their networks. In the case of illegal content and content that's harmful to children, there's duties to minimize the presence and dissemination of that content on their networks, and also, especially in the case of illegal speech, to swiftly remove that content. So there's a kind of notice and takedown mechanism. There are also requirements to set up complaints procedures, to specify in their terms and conditions how illegal content will be handled. I'd say that the weakest duty is that last duty, the duty to combat legal but harmful content to adults. And as far as I can tell, all this duty really requires is that companies specify in their terms and conditions how the harmful content will be dealt with. Dealt with is the term used in the legislation, but it's not entirely clear what dealt with means. At the very least, it means that the social media platform will have to specify what it will do with content like that. But it seems like leaving it up is compatible with that. And so it's actually a pretty weak duty. So I don't think there's actually a huge risk at the present that that swaths of legal but harmful speech toward adults will be taken down. I should briefly mention also that there's a kind of countervailing duty. I talked about the importance of making sure that legitimate speech is left up. And there is a duty to ensure that, quote, content of democratic importance is not unduly removed from the platform, although I think that duty, as it currently stands, is underspecified. So that's the rough sense of what the bill does. I should just say that it leaves a huge amount of detail to be worked out later by further regulations to be specified by the Secretary of State, to be implemented in codes of practice by Ofcom. So quite a lot of decisions, including decisions about what counts as harmful but legal content, is going to be taken down the road. And a lot of people are worried that minimizes the appropriate role of democratic debate and accountability in this process. And so it's an important point to mention.
And what do you make of that protection for content of democratic importance, as the bill calls it? A concern that many people have raised about that is that it would allow the sort of speech that took place in the United States before the 6th of January, before the storming of Congress, to be protected, because that is somehow about the democratic process, and therefore protecting misinformation that is within the democratic process seems to be what is implied by that provision.
Great. So I think that, so my view on this is that it's appropriate for the legislation to put mechanisms in place to militate against the over removal of content. But what we need greater clarity on is how this duty to protect content of democratic importance fits with the duties to remove illegal content and harmful but legal content. Which duty trumps the other, in other words? So if content runs afoul of hate speech laws in this country and yet takes the form of political content, I think because the content is already illegal, that would settle the issue. And I think that the duty to remove illegal content would win out in that case. I say that I think that would be the most normatively defensible view. I assume that would also be the view that the lawyers would take, but I think that remains to be specified in the legislation. Where it gets really tricky is where the duty to respect content of democratic importance fits with the duty to minimize the presence of legal but harmful content. And here I have the worry precisely that you raised about forms of electoral misinformation or disinformation, worries about extremely abusive, vitriolic rhetoric directed to political officials and others in public life that doesn't meet the standard of a crime, but is clearly harmful content that the legislation aims to get the platforms to do something about. And so I think the mere fact that someone is a politician, that someone is running for office, that someone is saying something that has to do with politics can't be a kind of trump card that immunizes them from interference at all. And so I think we need much greater clarity about this particular provision. I think it's underspecified at present.
And Melanie, what would you say about this bill? And one of the interesting things that Jeff is pointing to there is the lack of specificity in the bill, and the fact that a lot is being left for ministers, regulators to fill in the detail on. I guess ministers would make the point that, well, this is an area where things are so fast moving that if you try to kind of capture all the detail in the legislation, then by the time the legislation has hit the statute book, it's already out of date and the internet companies are actually doing something totally different. What would you say? Does the bill get that balance right?
No, the bill is extraordinarily complex, and there has been a lot of work and sort of within the consultations. Carnegie have just published in the last couple of days a sort of really good set of amendments of sort of how to simplify this, both from a structural way of thinking about outlining sort of and I think what they're advocating is actually a really good position of how they're doing it, sort of from the outset, the objectives of, and this needs to counteract that problem you've just highlighted, it's the objectives of the bill has to be centre forward, and from that has to everything else flow from that. And that includes this sort of expanded definitions they're recommending, for much more expanded and articulated definition of these harms, so whether they're physical, psychological, economic, whether it's public health, safety, public health, but also going to the democratic sort of context of sort of what's so things that interfere with democratic debate and the integrity and probity of the electoral process. And I think that's a different way of kind of reframing it that sort of gets underneath some of this nuance that you can look at. They're also sort of really calling into account, and I think this is an important point, of the risk assessment, or pushing for the sort of risk assessment process and how that's done. So cybersecurity, this is one way, notably falls apart a little, where you sort of get 193 in the US, 193 different cybersecurity sort of standards and regulations that people, and a lot of it becomes a tick box exercise. And how is that? And are these sort of really thinking about what will be these meaningful risk assessments for this oversight to really understand what, how the tech companies are going to deal with these dilemmas, how they're really unraveling themselves, and the procedural accountability so that safety is not circumvented. So there is a lot, as Jeff has pointed out, it's a good start. The bill as it stands needs a lot of work and refinement before it, or should go through a lot of work and refinement before it comes into play.
And if I understand correctly, you're both saying essentially, yes, okay, many of the mechanics of exactly what you regulate and how those need to be in the detail worked out afterwards. But actually, at this stage, the bill doesn't have enough clarity on the fundamental objectives and principles, and that needs to be sorted out before the bill becomes law. Thank you so much. I feel I understand a little bit better this area, but it's so complex and there's so much to discuss. There's a lot more for us to be thinking about over the coming months and years in the UK and around the world. So thank you so much, Melanie Garson and Jeff Howard, for helping clarify our thoughts on these matters. Next week, we will be reviewing the COP summit in Glasgow. How do the conclusions measure up against standards of justice? And what do they reveal about the balance of power in the negotiations? As ever, to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Rennick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.